I'm still sat here in Oxford with Catherine Tomas, and we've been talking about mysticism and various things. You also said you went to AAR recently in sunny San Diego, and while you were at the conference gave a paper. What was that about?
So the paper I gave was on a panel called "Doing Violence to Theology."
Okay, it always sounds kind of fun. Yeah,
which was the title that I proudly came up with, and the intention of the panel generally was to sort of question particular ways that theology is done.
Yeah.
And my particular paper was looking at texts of female mystics, so these mystics that I work with all the time, but reading them rather than as they have traditionally been read, as narratives of like a gradual submission before God, where the mystic realises that God loves her and she should devote her life to him. Actually, what I proposed is that when we read these texts closely, i.e. in their original language, not translated by problematic, misogynistic, often very sexist translators, what we see is in fact not that narrative, but actually a narrative of abuse. And what I mean by that is I use a model developed in the 1970s to look at, it's called the cycle of abuse, looks at the way in which women in abusive domestic situations rationalise and engage with their abusers. And there's 4 stages to this. The first is the build up to the abuse. So certain events happen in the relationship that build up to this flashpoint of often violence acting out, which is the second stage. And then the third stage is a rationalisation of the violence that's occurred. And then the fourth stage is not just a rationalisation, but a moving to a point where they blame themselves, or they try and make it very possible that the person who instigated the violence and the abuse was doing it for their own good.
So kind of reconciling to it.
Yeah, a reconciliation. And then what happens is the cycle starts again. So then it leads to another build-up, we have another acting out, another rationalisation. And this has been a model that's been used and respected when dealing with and engaging with women and children who were abused generally by male partners. And what I saw when I was reading these texts of mystics from the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th century were this pattern again and again. So in their autobiographies, when they're talking about the development of their relationship with God, they describe this, how they resisted his advances and his attempts.
So it's kind of really intrusive figure that won't leave them alone.
Precisely. So I suggested that this was a more accurate reading of these mystical texts, and I think it's important because if we have an understanding of God as potentially an abuser, then we have to ask the question, is this God good, and should we be...
Do our normal traditional understandings of how theology relates to that figure make sense?
And also particularly because these texts are used specifically for women as examples of how to be the ideal Christian woman.
Yeah, they have these. If you think who are the ideal Christian women in the history of theological thought, they're the kind of figures that would crop up.
Absolutely. So Teresa of Avila, the classic one. If you read her life, her autobiography, it's actually a terrible. It's impossible not to read it after you've seen it, been shown it once. Quite a sad tale of abuse, really, and finally Stockholm syndrome in a way, getting to love your abuser.
So that, I think, gives quite a good picture of the paper you gave in its very short version. How did that go down?
Well,
I'm just kind of curious the response.
It's funny, I've given this paper in 3 places. One at Roehampton at Tina Beattie's seminar, which is a Catholic institution, and and then also at the AAR, and then here at Oxford. And every time that I have given it was very strong reactions. Not always negative, which is surprising because most of my work's always really sort of generally responded to negatively by particularly conservative,
certain kind of
theologians, which is understandable. But it's very difficult because it's quite obvious comparison.
So you're able to make in your in the longer version of the paper quite a close fit between that, so people aren't able to necessarily.
It's very, very difficult to sort of separate it out, to sort of find faults with the comparison. The problem that people have is that generally they'll say, well, it's difficult we can't compare a text from the 11th century with a model of domestic violence from the 21st.
Yeah. So I wonder what would happen. This is a question that we haven't talked about in advance. I wonder what would happen if we were able to look at more contemporary mystics within the Catholic Church, and whether some of the traces of the patterns of their autobiographical material kind of still persists, and therefore it still would be amenable to being analysed in the same way.
I mean, I think opens up a whole collection of interesting questions, mainly that there are no contemporary living mystics, of course, because one of the key rules is that one will never be made a mystic for as long as you're alive, because of course you might say something wrong, and then you've got a problem.
So you need a certain amount of distance temporally.
Absolutely, you need at least 400 or 500 years. There are exceptions to that. There are mystics or people that have been begun the process of beatification sooner, but at least 100 years you can't really have much.
So that kind of makes it more difficult to and I guess that criticism or the kind of objection that people always raise is some kind of cultural distance.
Yes, absolutely.
In context.
Yeah.
But I think when it's so kind of clear cut, it provides a really kind of interesting starting point. What next?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
See, that was only 6.5.